The rain tapped lightly against the cracked windows of the studio, each droplet echoing the ticking of a clock that Eliza had long stopped trusting. She sat curled on the edge of the wide, dusty windowsill, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the city that had tried to forget her. In the distance, the lights of uptown boutiques shimmered through the mist, soft, expensive, cold. Just beyond those glowing glass walls, her designs were being paraded and priced like relics. But here, in her corner of the world, they still smelled of ink, fabric, and unfinished dreams. The studio was more workshop than sanctuary. Bolts of fabric leaned against paint-chipped walls. Sketches, patterns, scraps of linen and silk were scattered across the floor like fallen leaves in a storm. The radiator hadn't worked in weeks, and the only light came from a single overhead bulb, humming with a tired flicker. Above her drafting table, a hand-drawn portrait of her grandmother hung, a woman who had sewn dresses in the Harlem heat with no formal training, only calloused hands and a sharp eye. Her grandmother had taught her that beauty wasn't stitched into price tags, it was carved from grit and insistence. In her hand, Eliza held version 7 of a design she couldn't let go of. A long, fluid dress inspired by the curve of a tear and the weight of a memory. Every line had been argued with, fought over, reimagined. This piece was going to be the centerpiece. It was a protest in silk, a hymn in thread. It said everything she hadn't been allowed to say out loud when she was asked to step out of rooms or left off guest lists or told to intern for exposure. But this week was different. That morning, she had mailed a package, clean sketches, color tests, swatches of fabric to a contact she trusted in Paris. Someone who had once told her, in a voice quiet but certain, if you ever get tired of New York pretending not to see you, send it here. Now she waited. A buzz at the door startled her. The studio was on the 3rd floor of a warehouse-turned-creative ghetto, and visitors were rare. She descended the creaking stairs barefoot, her sketch still in hand. At the door, a delivery guy stood in a poncho holding a white envelope sealed with a wax stamp. Her heart caught in her throat. She signed, thanked him, and bolted the door behind her. Upstairs, she sat at the table and sliced the envelope open with a seam ripper. The paper inside was thick, the kind used only by institutions that didn't fear rejection. There was no preamble, no flattery, just an invitation. An exhibition. A feature. Her name. In serif font. In bold. They wanted her work in Paris. On the runway. Under her name. She laughed a short, cracked sound and dropped the envelope onto the table. It fluttered beside a crumpled receipt from a store that had refused to let her inside last week. Too selective, they said. Customers by referral. She remembered the saleswoman's eyes drifting over her frizzy curls, her paint-stained coat, the silence after Eliza asked about the dress in the window. That's not for people like you. She hadn't said a word. Hadn't made a scene. She'd only walked away. But now she would return. Not to shop. To reclaim. The following morning, she printed her acceptance letter and tucked it into her sketchbook. She wore the same coat, the same shoes, the same look on her face. Let them see her. Let them make the same assumptions. Let them play their part in the theater of condescension. She didn't need to shout her credentials. Her name would speak loud enough when it lit up on the Paris stage. She walked the same blocks she once limped home on after too many closed doors. She passed the boutique, the same one that had dismissed her, and paused. The same dress she'd asked about was still in the window. But now it bore a tag that said inspired by emerging New York talent. She smiled. Because they were right about one thing. It wasn't for people like her. It was by her. And now it would be hers again. The boutique looked different now, not in appearance, but in how Eliza saw it. The pristine white awning, the glossy black trim around the windows, the golden doorknob polished to mirror shine, all details she'd memorized when she used to pass it with longing. But now, as she stood on the sidewalk just before opening hours, the air around her didn't feel off limits. It was charged, expectant, like a stage before the curtain rose. Inside, the staff readied themselves with a quiet rhythm. Steaming garments, arranging accessories, resetting displays. They didn't notice her yet. She waited until the lock clicked and the door was nudged open. The same man who'd turned her away last time, buttoned shirt, designer belt, clipboard in hand, opened it without looking. When he finally glanced up, he didn't flinch, but the crease in his brow betrayed a flicker of recognition. "Good morning," Eliza said softly, stepping past him before he could form a gatekeeping sentence. The interior smelled like curated florals and privilege. Spotlights fell on mannequins in dramatic poses. One wore the dress. Not a knockoff, not a reproduction. It was hers. The exact stitch line, the signature drape on the collar, the asymmetry she had battled an entire panel of investors to preserve. They had changed the tag, renamed it, priced it for people who collected status like currency. But they hadn't touched the soul of it. That was still hers. She moved through the store like a ghost who had come back to reclaim her body. The staff gave her sideways glances. Some with curiosity, others with veiled judgment. She didn't belong here again. Her coat wasn't tailored, her shoes weren't glossy. But this time she didn't lower her eyes or retreat to the sidewalk. She went to the back wall where a giant framed photo showed a model in one of her designs striding through a minimalist backdrop. Her own sketch was clearly visible in the frame behind the model, blurred but unmistakable to the trained eye. They hadn't even bothered to crop it out. A woman with an iPad approached. She had that trained boutique tone, polite, clipped, designed to defend while appearing inviting. "Can I help you with anything?" Eliza turned and smiled. "You already have." She pulled the folded document from her coat and handed it to her. The woman read it, her posture slowly shifting from idle confidence to restrained concern. The name on the exhibition letter matched the one she'd been hearing murmurs about all week, Eliza Monroe. The designer who would open Paris Fashion Month with a full-featured segment. The one whom the magazine articles were calling the silent architect of the future of form. The woman glanced up from the letter, her tone softer now. "I didn't realize it." "No one does," Eliza said, taking the paper back. "That's how the industry likes it." By now, 2 other staff members were watching. One whispered something and pointed toward the dress on display. Eliza approached it. She let her fingers brush the edge of the fabric. The security tags still dangled from it like shackles. It stood beneath spotlights meant to make it glow. But she remembered the dim desk light under which she first draped that fabric, adjusting it over a mannequin that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others. She remembered the ache in her fingers, the pricks of the needle, the pressure in her chest that only left when she saw it finished. And now it stood here, with no name on the tag, no attribution, just numbers, just assumptions. She pulled her phone from her pocket, opened the camera, took a photo, not for vanity, not for proof, but for record. Because the world loved to forget the women like her. The ones who built the runways but weren't invited to walk them. She turned to leave. But before she reached the door, another woman entered. Young, bright-eyed, dressed in brand-new heels too tight for comfort. She looked like Eliza once had, just starting, eager, full of that dangerous belief that hard work would always be enough. Their eyes met. The girl's gaze dropped quickly, almost instinctively. Eliza knew that reaction well. But today, she didn't let it happen. She stopped, took out her card, pressed it into the girl's palm. "If anyone tells you it's not for people like you," she said, "you remind them who designs the world they're standing in." And with that, she stepped back into the light of the morning, no longer on the outside looking in, but walking toward something far bigger than their gate-kept glass walls could ever hold. By the time Eliza reached the subway, the boutique was already disappearing behind her like a bad dream fading into morning haze. The city was alive again. Horns, brakes, murmured podcasts through earbuds, coffee lines. But something had shifted. Not in the city, in her. Her steps no longer felt like survival. They were motion. They were intent. She descended into the belly of the station, weaving through the tide of commuters. She noticed the familiar things. Scuffed floors, faded maps, ads for perfumes she'd never buy. But now her attention was sharper, not dulled by daily resistance. She felt herself peeling away from what the city expected of her, from what it had tried to reduce her to. She wasn't just moving through the world anymore. She was shaping it, line by line, stitch by stitch. The train pulled in with a groan. As she boarded, her phone buzzed. A message from the Paris exhibit director. A high-profile buyer wanted to preview her unreleased designs. They'd seen a leaked sketch in a magazine spread and wanted to commission a capsule collection. They called her the new voice in silhouette theory. She stared at the screen, emotion rising not as pride, but quiet vindication. She sat near the window. A man across the aisle eyed her sketchbook resting in her lap, open just slightly. He looked from it to her and then back again, as if surprised someone like her was holding something so delicate, so precise. She didn't offer him a smile. She didn't owe him reassurance. When she arrived back at the studio, the room felt smaller. Not in a suffocating way, but as if it had served its purpose and was ready to evolve. The sketches on the walls, the materials spread across the table, even the light filtering through the blinds. It all looked like yesterday's version of her. And today she was something else. Eliza cleared the table with both hands, sweeping away the scraps of failed concepts and dusty samples. She pulled out a fresh bolt of cloth, gunmetal gray with a shimmer that caught the light like wet pavement. She pinned it to her wall, then taped a blank sheet next to it. This collection wouldn't chase trends. It wouldn't compromise on origin or ownership. It would speak not just for her, but for every woman who had ever been asked if she was in the right place. For every girl who had been told to fetch coffee when she came to build an empire. For every hand that had stitched brilliance into seams only to see her work walk the runway under someone else's name. That evening, she worked in silence. No music, no distraction. Just the sound of chalk tracing intention onto paper. She worked through sunset, through hunger, through the ache in her back. By midnight, she had 5 silhouettes, bold, structured, unapologetic. Armor disguised as elegance. And as the clock neared 2 a.m., she wrote their names beside each sketch. Not numbers, not model codes. Names. All women. All warriors. She took one final look around her studio. It was no longer a cocoon. It had become a forge. The next day brought the meeting. They sent a black car. A sleek office greeted her downtown, minimalist and pristine, decorated with framed Vogue covers and coffee table books no one read. The assistant offered her sparkling water. She declined. Inside the boardroom, the buyers sat waiting. 2 men in tailored suits, a woman in a blazer worth more than Eliza's rent. They smiled politely without warmth. A formality, a test. She laid out her sketches one by one, unfolding them like weapons on a battlefield. As she spoke, the room changed. They leaned in. They asked. They nodded. The woman in the blazer put down her phone. The older man finally said what she'd expected. These are powerful, but they might not resonate with the kind of customer we usually attract. The tone is strong. Eliza didn't blink. That's the point. I'm not designing for who your customer is now. I'm designing for who she's becoming. There was a pause. Then the woman in the blazer smiled. Eliza, she said, I think you're about to change this industry. She didn't say thank you. Instead, she gathered her papers, left them with the team, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the sky was gray but bright. A storm was coming, and for once she welcomed it, because storms clear the air. The storm arrived in Paris before Eliza did. Not the weather, though it was raining when she stepped off the plane, but something deeper. Headlines, murmurs, sudden shifts in the fashion press. Her name wasn't just on the list. It was on the lips of editors, buyers, and skeptics who had long ignored names that didn't come with inherited legacies. Whispers of her debut collection carried a rare electricity. They called it subversive, revolutionary, angry, beautiful. She watched it unfold from the car window as she was driven through narrow stone streets, past cafes where stylists traded gossip over espresso, past ateliers where she would never have been allowed through the door 10 years ago. This time, she wasn't visiting. She was the show. At the hotel, a handwritten note waited on her pillow. It was from a legendary fashion editor known for her cruelty, whose approval was rare and whose condemnation could end careers. Eliza turned the card in her hands twice before opening it. 2 lines in looping ink. I was wrong. The world needs what you make. She set it down without reaction. The next morning, the final fitting took place. Models rotated through the suite in silence as seamstresses made minor adjustments. The room buzzed with controlled energy. Eliza moved through them like a general preparing for war. Not with force, but with unbreakable calm. The garments fit flawlessly. Her designs looked even bolder in movement. Sharp silhouettes, sweeping lines, power embedded in grace. One dress moved like wind across water. Another stood like stone in fire. Each model, regardless of origin or body shape, wore the clothing not as decoration but as identity. She hadn't just created clothes. She had given these women armor. The venue was an abandoned palace converted into a catwalk, lit from within like a temple. Gold and stone reflected cool light onto walls lined with press, influencers, and industry giants. Behind the curtain, Eliza stood with a headset around her neck, hands steady. No nerves. No questions. She thought of her grandmother again. Bent over a sewing machine, sighing into the steam of an iron, humming gospel while making clothes she'd never afford. Eliza's hands had held the same scissors, made the same cuts, walked the same line between invisibility and rebellion. And now the doors opened. The music pulsed low and deep, like a heartbeat in the dark. The first model stepped out, and then the next. The silence in the room wasn't absence. It was awe. Cameras clicked. Pens paused. Critics leaned forward. This wasn't a debut. This was an arrival. Each look told a piece of the story. Exclusion, resistance, reclamation, triumph. One ensemble bore a pattern based on red lines from housing maps. Another used recycled uniforms from defunct corporations. One piece, the closing dress, was constructed entirely from torn atelier cast-offs, stitched by hand into something both fragile and defiant. That was the one that made the audience rise from their seats. At the end, she walked out, not to wave or bow, but to stand. She stood there, silent, as flashbulbs lit the air around her. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. I was here. You tried to keep me out. I designed the door. Afterward, she didn't attend the parties. She walked alone through Paris in the rain, heels in hand, hair wet, face calm. On her way back, she passed a boutique. In the window hung a dress from her first uncredited collection, now with a placard bearing her name. But she didn't stop. Recognition wasn't the reward. Ownership was. That night, in her hotel room, she opened her email to hundreds of messages, press requests, collaboration offers, investors. But one caught her eye. It was from a young woman she didn't know. Just a single sentence. I saw you today. I'm next. Eliza closed the laptop. Outside, the city exhaled. The thunder rolled away. The storm had passed. But her season had just begun. New York greeted her differently this time. Not with indifference, not with suspicion, but with pause. With curiosity. With the slow-brewing reverence the city reserved for the few it had once dismissed and now couldn't afford to ignore. When Eliza stepped off the plane, no one rushed toward her with cameras. But people turned. Someone whispered. A stranger mouthed her name. In the weeks that followed, the waves she had stirred in Paris crashed onto American shores with growing force. Her name appeared not only in fashion columns but in business sections, art critiques, TED Talk promos. The fashion world, notoriously slow to change and quick to mimic, began repeating her phrases, mimicking her silhouettes, parroting the language of power she had stitched into silk. They didn't understand her, but they wanted her, and that, she had learned, was enough to take their money and redirect the current. Her inbox became a battlefield of intent. Contracts, invitations, partnerships, offers with zeros she had never imagined seeing beside her name. But she remembered something her grandmother once told her when Eliza was still just learning to thread a needle. Be careful who offers you gold. Sometimes, it costs more than it shines. So she read everything. Line by line, clause by clause. She turned down the biggest check of her life because it came with an NDA and a whisper that she'd be taken more seriously if she let someone else be the face. She didn't want to be taken seriously. She wanted to take up space. She said yes to the deal that gave her full creative control. Yes to the one that gave back to the hands that made the clothes, not just the ones that sold them. And yes to a flagship boutique. Not in Soho, not in Fifth Avenue, but in the neighborhood where her grandmother's kitchen had once doubled as a sewing studio. The building was old, neglected, forgotten, just like she had been. She bought it in cash. The first time she walked through it, she ran her fingers along the cracked windowsill, just like she had done in her old studio. Dust curled around her boots. The light came in sideways, cutting through silence. She stood in the center and closed her eyes. She saw it. Hardwood floors, high ceilings, walls lined with sketches and stories. Fitting rooms where girls who'd been told no could finally see themselves in something made with them in mind. A showroom not built for exclusivity, but celebration. Behind the counter, a quote from her grandmother would hang on the wall. Make space, even when you're not given any. Construction began that month. As the boutique took shape, so did the new collection. This one wasn't for Fashion Week. It wasn't for critics or investors. It was for the people who had written to her in quiet. Single mothers stitching clothes between shifts. Trans women who had never worn something made for their frame. Teenagers who sketched between homework and hunger. She collected their stories. Literally. Each garment in the collection would carry a hidden pocket with a printed letter from someone the world had overlooked. Every piece was a mirror. Every stitch a reply to someone who had once been told, "That's not for people like you." The opening night of the boutique wasn't glamorous. There was no red carpet, no champagne tower, just music, laughter, and people who had never been invited before. Former seamstresses now led design tours. A girl from Eliza's neighborhood, 15, wearing one of the new jackets, cried quietly in front of a mirror, saying she had never seen herself look this strong. Eliza watched from the mezzanine, unnoticed, content. She wore no name tag, no power suit, just her grandmother's pin on her collar. A symbol, a beginning. At one point, a woman walked into the store, confused, clearly affluent, clearly unfamiliar with the place. She asked a staff member if she could speak to who's in charge. The staff pointed up. The woman looked at Eliza and furrowed her brow. "You're the owner?" Eliza met her eyes, calm and grounded. "No," she said with a soft smile. "I'm the architect." The woman blinked, unsure what that meant. Eliza didn't explain. She didn't need to. Outside, the city pulsed as always. But somewhere between the asphalt and the skyline, something had shifted. They used to say, "That's not for people like you." Now they say, "Who made this?" And the answer, finally, proudly, undeniably, is her. It began, as so many things do, with silence. Not the silence of failure or fear, but a reverent quiet, the kind that follows a revolution no one thought to see coming. Eliza stood in the green room of a vast auditorium where hundreds were now seated beyond the velvet curtain. She wasn't wearing one of her designs. She wasn't here to sell anything. She wasn't flanked by models or stylists. Tonight, she was simply herself. And that was enough. The event was a global summit on design innovation, live-streamed, press-covered, and, until this year, dominated by the same few names. For the first time, the keynote speaker wasn't a European architect, a billionaire tech creative, or a legacy label head. It was her. Behind her on a screen glowed the words, "Eliza Monroe, Design Beyond Gatekeeping." Her hands were steady, her breath even. The noise in her mind was gone. What replaced it was a single image. Her grandmother's hands folding fabric at a kitchen table in a two-room apartment, humming, always humming. Those hands were why she could stand here now. The curtain rose. The crowd erupted. But she didn't soak in the applause. She stepped forward with quiet confidence and began to speak. She didn't talk about success. Not the kind they were expecting. She didn't talk about fashion weeks or investors or deals. She spoke of rejection, of walking into rooms and feeling the air stiffen, of being told by silence that you don't belong. She spoke of working in the shadows of others who wore her work like crowns, never knowing who had stitched them. She spoke of dignity, of labor, of legacy. She showed slides, a dress with redlining maps, a jacket made from discarded uniforms, a bag constructed from letters written by factory workers, printed on silk and sewn into the lining. Each one, a declaration, "I see you." She spoke of access, of how the industry measured worth by visibility, of how she had learned to stop asking for permission, of how gatekeeping wasn't a wall, it was a mirror, and if you looked at it long enough, you'd start to believe you were on the wrong side of it. Until one day you broke it and built a window instead. When she finished, the room didn't cheer right away. They stood. They stood as if something had shifted in them, as if they saw themselves for the first time, not as buyers or critics or executives, but as people capable of more than following, people capable of designing. Afterwards, backstage, the press swarmed politely. Microphones, questions, photos. One journalist, young, nervous, held a recorder too close and asked the question Eliza had heard in some form her entire life. How did you get past the people who told you that this world wasn't made for you? Eliza tilted her head, her eyes calm, unblinking. I stopped believing it was their world. That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, still in the modest shoes that had carried her through it all, she passed a mural, newly painted, a collaboration between her foundation and a group of young artists. It stretched across the side of a school building, tall and impossible to miss. The mural depicted a young black girl, no older than 12, standing in front of a glowing storefront. Her reflection in the glass showed her not as a shopper, but as a creator, blueprint in hand, her designs lit from within. Above her, in bold letters, "It's not for people like you," they said. So she redesigned everything. Eliza paused, her throat catching. Not for grief, not for pain, but for the weight of it. The full-circle gravity of knowing that every door closed had made space for a better one she would build herself. She turned the corner, her figure swallowed by the golden lights of the city, moving not like someone who had arrived, but like someone who had just begun. Because she had. And this time, nothing was off-limits. Not the brand, not the room, not the dream, because she designed it. All of it.